Right, this weekend is the British Grand Prix, one of my favourite weekends on the whole calendar really. In recent years, Silverstone has produced some amazing races. We've had 11 different winners in the past 11 races. Silverstone is super unpredictable. It's one of my favourite races on the whole calendar. However, despite this, in the UK and amongst all the other MotoGP races, the British Grand Prix always feels like a bit of a non-event. And this is an issue which has mostly stemmed from a lack of good attendances at Silverstone for MotoGP. Silverstone has always struggled to match the attendances of Formula 1, there's no surprise in that. However, in recent years, there's been a massive decline in the attendances at MotoGP. 2022 saw a record low with just over 100,000 people across the whole weekend. Last year there was a 6,000 person decrease on the Sunday compared to 2023. And to be honest, I think this year there's going to be a record low attendance for MotoGP at Silverstone. So I want to take a look at this and look at why the attendances at Silverstone are so low for MotoGP, what can be done to rise the attendances, and whether this stems from an issue of just a lack of support of MotoGP in the UK. So yeah, let's just get straight into it. But first, I want to look at why I think the attendances are going to be a record low this year, and there's one main reason for it, and it is due to the scheduling of the British Grand Prix this year. Last year, the British Grand Prix was on the first week of August, right in the middle of the holidays, the summer holidays. It was the first race back from the summer break, and, it was a good space in the calendar for the British Grand Prix to go. This year, it has been moved to the 25th of May, and let me just explain why I think this is the worst possible place to put the British Grand Prix, and it's due to all the clashes there's going on with it. The British Grand Prix for MotoGP is on the same weekend as the Monaco Grand Prix for Formula 1. That's alright, because you always get clashes between F1 and MotoGP. The Monaco Grand Prix is quite a significant one, but it's not the end of the world. The British Grand Prix is also on the same weekend as the Indy 500, one of the biggest sporting or motorsport events in the whole world. And I think the most egregious one is it is one day before the start of the Isle of Man. Now, the Isle of Man is by far the most popular and well-known motorcycle event in the country, and there will be many people who, across the year, will want to go to both the British Grand Prix for MotoGP and the Isle of Man. However, this year they are separated by literally one day, so there's going to be a lot of people who would usually go to both who have to choose between the British Grand Prix and the Isle of Man. And considering how famous the Isle of Man is, and how it's a bucket list thing for a lot of people to do, there'll be a good amount of people who would usually go to the British Grand Prix who are going to go to the Isle of Man instead, because it is almost impossible for someone to go to both of them this year. I think it's a truly terrible decision to have them both placed so close to each other. And as well as this isn't motorsport related, it's on the same weekend as the playoff finals in football. Last year the MotoGP British Grand Prix was away from any of the football season hadn't started yet. However, the playoff final for so many people across the country is the biggest game of the season. There'll be probably around 200,000 people going down to London over that weekend to see their team play at Wembley. And I know myself, I support Coventry City. If they'd have got to Wembley, I'd have been going there instead of the British Grand Prix. And I'm sure there are thousands of other people who are in the same boat. I think there'll be a lot of people who would usually go to the British Grand Prix who will be skipping that opportunity to go see their team at Wembley to see their team get promoted. I do think that these four events happening on the same weekend as the British Grand Prix is going to have a massive effect on attendances. There'll be so many people, especially for the playoffs and for the Isle of Man, who will just be incapable of going to both at once, and they'll choose the one they'd rather go to, which in many cases would be the Isle of Man or the playoff final. So yeah, poor scheduling this year I think has set up the British Grand Prix for a bit of a disaster really. I really would be shocked if it isn't a record low attendance this year. Especially if you combine that with the fact that Marc Marquez has been dominating MotoGP this year. There'll be definitely some people who wouldn't bother this year because they're just going to think, oh, Marc Marquez is going to win. When of course that isn't going to happen, but some people will have that logic. Yeah, I'd be astonished if the attendances aren't a record low this year. However, this isn't just a problem from this year. MotoGP attendances at Silverstone have been on a downer for ages, and let's look at the main reasons as to why. Now, on the face of it, you'd expect Silverstone to have pretty good attendances for MotoGP. Silverstone is right in the middle of the country, it's quite accessible for most people. It's not like it's right in the corner of somewhere in the UK. It's right in the middle, it's not too far away for anyone. It's also one of the most iconic tracks in the entire world, so people will always want to go to see an event there. And it's produced some amazing races in recent years, so you'd expect the attendances to be pretty decent or better than what they have been in recent years. However, they've been really poor, and I think a big reason for that is the ticket prices. It's no secret that the organisers at Silverstone can get a bit greedy with their ticket prices. For Formula 1, the cheapest grandstand ticket I can find is over £300, and that is an extortionate price. However, considering it's Formula 1, people are always going to buy that. It's always going to sell out. And I am almost certain that the organisers think they can do the exact same for MotoGP. They think they can hike the prices up really high and expect people to pay it anyway. However, when the audience for MotoGP is so much smaller in the UK than Formula 1, there's always going to be a huge decline in prices. No, there's always going to be a huge decline in attendances when you have the prices so high. The cheapest grandstand ticket I have found for a 3-day weekend is £145 for Silverstone. By the way, this isn't taking into consideration the additional price of a car parking ticket, which is an extra 30 fucking quid. Now let's just quickly compare that to some of the other more iconic tracks and more well-attended tracks across the calendar. At Le Mans, the cheapest ticket is £128, Jerez is £80, Mugello is pretty similar, £143, Assen £135, and Catalonia is £117. All are for a grandstand ticket for 3 days. Silverstone is the most expensive of all of them. And when you're in a country that doesn't have the same support for MotoGP as like Italy and Spain do, you can't afford to have prices like those because people just aren't going to cough up the money to pay for it. Prices that high mean that casuals who don't really care that much about what they're watching, they just want to go to see some sort of event, they're priced out. I remember when I was little, me and my dad would go to, I think it was Donington Park, and we'd go to watch some random truck racing. And that was great fun. I had no idea what I was watching, but it was truck racing, that was really cool. And there'd be some people who would like to do the same for MotoGP, however, considering it's £145, they're just too priced, it's just too expensive. It'd be so much easier for someone, if they wanted to see a race, to go see a World Superbike race or a British Superbike race. It'd be so much cheaper than going to MotoGP. So it means that the only people attending are the hardcore MotoGP fans who have probably been going for years. These extortionate ticket prices means that you're not going to get many new people coming through the gates every year. I do really think that if the prices for tickets at Silverstone were a lot cheaper, there'd be a big rise in attendances. Let's take Jerez for example. They were the cheapest one I looked up. They had £80 for a 3-day ticket in a grandstand. If Silverstone offered that, I guarantee there'd be a much higher attendances than what we've seen in recent years. And I do think that Silverstone's greed is a big reason why we're not seeing many people in through the gates every year. One thing that I completely forgot to mention was the fact that these extortionate ticket prices are going to have an effect on tourism. Like, if you were a tourist looking to go to a MotoGP race abroad, why the hell would you choose to go to Silverstone? It's one of the most expensive tracks on the calendar, the most expensive of all the ones that I looked at. And also, compared to tracks like Jerez or Le Mans, the atmosphere is pretty shit. Silverstone is just not an appealing place for tourists to go to see MotoGP. Some people would go there once just to tick it off to say they've done it, however, I'm sure you'd get a much better experience if you went to somewhere like Assen or Le Mans. So yeah, that's just another way how the extortionate ticket prices are completely screwing the attendances at Silverstone. However, I do think the lack of attendances isn't just with the ticket prices. I do think that there is a big issue with just a lack of interest of MotoGP in the UK. And a big reason for a lack of interest is the lack of good riders, lack of good British riders in MotoGP. Especially now that Valentino Rossi has retired, there's no world superstar for MotoGP. Marc Marquez is pretty big, but not everybody knows him, especially in the UK. And especially when you've got no homegrown talent who can represent the country and make a name for themselves, the sport's just not going to grow in the country. MotoGP hasn't had a Premier Class champion since 1977. The only champion in any class since then was Danny Kent in 2015, I believe. And he ended up getting arrested and giving a suspended prison sentence. So when that's your last champion in nearly 50 years, you're never going to have any sort of growth of the sport in the UK. I'm going to compare it to Formula 1 again, but in F1 you've got Lewis Hamilton, who is one of the most famous people in the country. Even if you don't watch Formula 1, if you don't care about it at all, everyone in the country knows about Lewis Hamilton. Whereas in MotoGP, the biggest superstar in the past 40 years is Cal Crutchlow, who was a good rider in his day, but 3 Grand Prix victories, you're not going to make a name for yourself in your homeland with that, especially when the majority of people don't care about MotoGP. The UK for decades now has really lacked a superstar who can fly the flag for the country and, make a name for themselves in the country. We've seen like France, for example. They've had massive attendance rises at Le Mans recently. They keep setting attendance records, and a big part of that is the emergence of Fabio Quartararo. France now have a superstar who they can get behind, as well as Johann Zarco, but Quartararo especially. They've got that superstar now who they can support in every race, and they can support at their home Grand Prix and get behind. And as a result, MotoGP in France has skyrocketed in popularity over the past few years. And if the UK was able to get someone even just in MotoGP, I do think it would help grow the sport a lot in this country. And with the current crop of riders in the MotoGP grid at the moment, the British ones, I really don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. The best hope we've got at the moment is Jake Dixon, but he's 29, he's nearing the end of his career really. I'd be amazed if he gets a MotoGP seat. And after that, Scott Ogden's the best. I really don't have much hope for him getting into MotoGP. So yeah, I think a lack of good British riders on the grid makes it a lot harder for someone in the UK to discover MotoGP. And as a result, I think that has a big effect on attendances in the UK, because if the sport isn't getting discovered in the UK enough, you're not going to get more people in through the gates. And the final thing I want to cover is just the general lack of coverage of MotoGP in the UK. Now, of course, this is affected by the fact that there's no superstar in the UK, there's no homegrown talent for all the outlets to write about. However, despite that, there's still a really disappointing lack of news coverage on MotoGP from the mainstream outlets. Like when Jake Dixon won his home Grand Prix last year in Moto2, the BBC report of it didn't even mention it once. It just mentioned the MotoGP race. Not one mention of the home rider winning his home Grand Prix. And I think that just shows the lack of, interest and coverage of the sport in the UK. None of the major news outlets seem to care about MotoGP enough to write about it, and it makes it so much harder to discover MotoGP for British people, like I was discussing with the lack of good riders. It means that no one's going to discover MotoGP, and like I said, that's going to have an effect on attendances. Now finally, I want to touch on, I think, what is the most damaging thing for the growth of MotoGP in the country, and that is Discovery Plus, and the fact that to watch MotoGP, you pretty much have to pay 31 quid per month for Discovery Plus. Now, on one hand, I think that the coverage that Discovery Plus do for MotoGP is amazing. I really love the commentary team, the presenting team. The coverage they do is great. However, the fact that the only way to watch MotoGP is to pay £31 a month, it makes it so much harder for the sport to grow in the UK. Once again, I'm going to compare it to Formula 1. However, F1, all the live races are behind a paywall on Sky Sports. However, despite that, there's still a highlight show which, about 4 hours after the race is finished, Channel 4 have their own highlight show, so you can watch the highlights of the race on the same day, and they're still good length highlights, they're about an hour long. MotoGP has no sort of highlight show whatsoever available for free, and it means that people who aren't willing to pay for the extortionate prices for Discovery Plus just aren't going to be able to see MotoGP because they can't watch it, it's only behind a paywall. Now, I'm aware that apparently all the sprints are shown for free and a couple of races each year get shown for free. However, there's absolutely no promotion for this whatsoever. I've not seen any adverts at all for the British MotoGP Grand Prix this weekend. I've seen none of that at all. For Formula 1, when they do get the British Grand Prix live on Channel 4, you do see quite a bit of promotion for it. MotoGP, there's just nothing, and like I said, it's just not making people aware of MotoGP. No one's going to discover it, and no one's going to go to the races if no one's discovering it. I really think that the lack of promotion for MotoGP and the fact that it's behind a paywall in the UK, you have to pay to watch it, is really damaging for the growth of MotoGP in this country. I think it'd be really great if MotoGP was able to have a highlight show in the UK where like F1, about 4 or 5 hours after the race, you're able to watch the highlights of the race for free on a completely free channel. And this would allow so much more people to discover MotoGP when just casually browsing like their TV guide. Yeah, I do really think that the effect of having MotoGP behind a paywall is really damaging for the growth of the sport in the country, and I really don't think that we're going to see much of a rise in Silverstone attendances until you either see MotoGP become not behind a paywall or you see a decrease in ticket prices. I do think those are the main two things. The fact that you can't discover MotoGP at all if you're not already a fan of it, or you don't have family members that are a fan of it, and the fact that a lot of people just can't afford ticket prices. Those are the main two things, I think. I think there'd be a lot of people who would much rather go to watch a World Superbike race at Donington Park for significantly cheaper than at Silverstone. So yeah, that's all I've got to say really. I think that those are the main two things that are causing a lack of attendances at Silverstone. Lack of discoverability and ticket prices. But yeah, that's what I think are the main reasons why Silverstone attendances are so low for MotoGP. But I want to know what you guys think, so let me know in the comments. Why do you think the Silverstone attendances are so low for MotoGP? Let me know in the comments. And while there, make sure to leave a like on the video and subscribe to the channel if you did enjoy the video. I hope you all enjoyed this video, and I'll see you guys very soon. Bye bye.